afternoon, friends. Welcome to the 2022 Cinematters New York Social Justice Film Festival and to this afternoon's Q&A on Ricochet. I'm Cheryl Parker, Director of Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan's Joseph Stern Center for Social Responsibility, and I could not be more proud to welcome you to what I know will be a fascinating conversation on an important topic. But before we begin, as we join together this weekend to promote social action and community change, our hearts and thoughts are with the Jewish community of Colleyville, Texas. We are grateful that all of the hostages at Congregation Beth Israel have been released, and we send our prayers for peace and healing to them, their families, their congregation, and their community. Let's work together to make this a world where anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other forms of hate are eradicated, and where synagogues, churches, mosques, and other places of worship are places of joyful community, not fear. We invite you to join us for a short community-wide program of prayer and reflection this afternoon immediately after this program at 5:30 p.m. And we will put a link to that in the chat in just a moment that you can use. During this weekend's festival, which is a collaboration between the JCC Stern Center for Social Responsibility and the Carol Zabar Center for Film, we'll be exploring some of the most crucial topics facing our society through film, conversations, events, and more, all in the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy to promote social action and collective change. We are so happy that you are able to join us. Social responsibility is at the core of who we are and what we stand for as a JCC. Through this festival and the work we do in our Center for Social Responsibility, we're building a community of civic-minded individuals who help create positive change in our society and beyond. Our films will be streaming on demand all weekends, and we also have a number of great programs like this one. So please join us and invite your friends and your family. Coming up next, tomorrow, we have a Q&A on our shorts programming taking place at 2 p.m. You can see a full list of films and programs at cinematters.film. I'm going to now turn the session over to our moderator. Harold Solis is the Deputy Legal Director at Make the Road New York, where he works closely with MRNY's organizers and legal staff to develop policies that center the organization's members and are responsive to the needs of the broader immigrant community. Harold?
Hi, Cheryl. Thank you for having me. Hey everyone, I hope you can hear me now. I might have had some audio issues there. It's Zoom life. Like I was saying, I'm really delighted to be here with all of you and with this panel. I'm really excited to have this conversation with everyone here. And to get us started, I'm just going to do some quick bios, and then I'm hoping we can really just dive right into what I hope will be an insightful conversation. Today's panel includes, the folks that you saw on during the film, or will see in the film. I'm going to start with Matt Gonzalez, who is the Chief Attorney at the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. This is a position he's held for more than a decade. He represented Jose Inés Garcia Zarate as co-counsel in state court. We also have with us Francisco Ugarte, who manages the Immigrant Defense Unit at the San Francisco Public Defender's Office, which formed in 2017 and is now California's largest detained deportation defense provider. He also represented Jose Inés Garcia Zarate in state court as co-counsel. In addition, we have somebody here who helped actually to create this film and bring it to us. We have one of the co-directors, Chihiro Wimbush, who is an Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker. Chihiro was co-director and cinematographer on another documentary known as Dogtown Redemption about homeless shopping cart recyclers in West Oakland, California. He has done a ton of work around social issues, and I'm really excited to hear his perspective on this particular film. And last but not least, we have Sophia Gurule, who is a public defense attorney representing incarcerated immigrants facing deportation here in my hometown of New York at the Bronx Defenders. She works closely with the New York Immigrant Family Unity Project, and she's also Immigration Policy Counsel for Bronx Defenders. Well, with introductions, I hope that gives you a sense of the breadth of expertise that we have on today's panel and the different experiences that I hope will bring to this conversation. The first question, I'm going to throw it to you, Chihiro. I'd love for you to share with us, why this film, why this case? What was the vision that you had when you set out to work on this?
Well, thank you, Harold. I should probably start really at the beginning in that Jeff Ugarte, who is obviously both my co-director on this, but also the San Francisco Public Defender, more famously. He and I had worked together for the last several years on a series of films. And so it was really part of an ongoing partnership in a way where I think we started working in fall of 2016. And Jeff had this vision of doing a series of films about the criminal justice system as seen through the eyes of the public defender's office and the unique vantage point that offers. And so we'd done a short film called The Ride, and also a feature film called Defender that actually features quite a bit of Francisco in it, and is a little bit of a prequel to this film because it shows the founding in many ways of the Immigration Defense Unit at the office. And so this film, Ricochet, seemed like a natural extension of that process, partly because of Jeff's original vision of this series of films, but also coming out of Defender and showing kind of really at the beginning of the Trump era how immigration defense was becoming an integral part of sort of the intersection of immigration and criminal defense was really becoming much more pronounced in the Trump era. When this came through, obviously it had quite a bit of national attention. And so on that level, it made it just a natural fit for something to investigate because of the impact that it was having and the awareness. But it also kind of built on this process of wanting to kind of unpack the ever evolving role of the public defender's office over time as the world changed for all of us, but particularly in relation to this realm of criminal defense and immigration. And when you add the layers of politics and media as well, all these things still feel just as relevant today. And so, of course, we didn't know all that way back when we were doing it, just how significant many of the things would continue to be. But it did feel like a very important moment in time to record. And it feels like it still has just so much resonance even now.
And towards the end of the film, we learn, right, that Jeff passed away not too long ago, as you mentioned. What was the impact of his death on this process?
Well, devastating for all of us. I mean, I worked with him creatively, but I think probably it might be the least for me. I mean, the public defenders who worked with him every day, obviously his family, and the community who really relied on his vision and was positively impacted by his work. So I mean, I can only speak for myself in the sense of I had to put everything on pause for a while. There was a period for sort of collective grieving, and also to kind of take a moment to honor his legacy of who he was. And I think it took 6 months really before it felt appropriate really to kind of go back and take a look at the film. And there were many conversations with both Matt and Francisco, as well as Mutzko, Jeff's widow, who is an integral part of this process, because without her blessing and without a lot of her help for kind of broader emotional conceptual things, but also very mundane things like, oh, do you know where Jeff kept all the release forms and things like that, like things that Jeff had in his possession. And so it was another maybe 6 months of unpacking all that, and maybe a year before creative work really picked up again. And so there was this kind of, we'd luckily already filmed everything. And so when Jeff passed, I think we were kind of at sort of a very rough cut assembly, and we had a bunch of footage together. And so revisiting it a year later, in some ways, there was this very fresh perspective that was helpful, but it also had that extra sort of layer of Jeff's passing and the weight of that, both in just terms of the moment, but also just in terms of kind of the, to some degree, the pressure to say, okay, this was Jeff's legacy as a public defender, as a filmmaker, and what can I do to not screw that up in bringing this film to the finish line?
Thank you. I'd love to actually maybe get into some of the, the issues that were raised, both by the case and by the film itself, right? Maybe why don't I toss some questions your way, Matt and Francisco? You both seemed super cool and calm and collected throughout the entire process, even though, at the time it was clear that there was such a, national spotlight on this case. I'd love to hear from both of you, what you thought were some of the most important issues raised by this case. Maybe even some of the sanctuary city type discussions that we've heard raised. Maybe I can start with you, Matt.
Sure. Thanks for having us. Let me just start off by saying, the resources that the office put into this case were really not different than what we would have put into any trial over a homicide. And that's interesting because I think a lot of folks who see this film might have this idea that it was like, all hands on deck. And the truth is we do a lot of case conferencing and in our office, and it was something Jeff very much nurtured and supported, the idea of really trying to get more eyes on something and kick around ideas. I think that had Donald Trump not been talking about the case, the amount of attention that this case would have gotten would have been about probably, one weekend of kind of news cycle activity. It's hard to sustain for the public imagination something for years, and we were quite surprised that this just kept going, and Trump was able to capitalize it and keep it going. I think the media attention, or getting in front of cameras or just dealing with that reality wasn't the big challenge that we had. The big challenge that we had was the repetition of facts about the case that were not true, or that we felt we had sufficiently already dealt with. And so, Francisco, I'll turn it to you to say more about that.
Yeah, I think by the time the movie started, we had been in the case for about 2 years. And when the case first started in 2015, that was really when a lot of the stress, a lot of the anxiety took place, because at that time there was a national uproar kind of being catapulted by Donald Trump about sanctuary cities. And in the very first 2 weeks of the case, we didn't know that it was a ricochet. What we did have was a confession from Mr. Garcia Zarate, well, what the police called a confession, saying that he had shot Kate Steinle about 5 feet away and walked over her body as she was bleeding. And that turned out to be completely false. That was a coerced confession based on a very coercive interrogation. And so that was very challenging, because nobody seemed to want to hear what we had to say about anything, and they wanted to blame Sanctuary City, San Francisco, for the death. And I had never tried a felony case before this. I was an immigration attorney. I had been an attorney for about 10 years, and I had been really on the front lines of sanctuary struggles. I'd represented many people in San Francisco who were transferred to ICE as a result of a local law enforcement contact. And we worked very hard to implement one of the strongest sanctuary policies in the country. And so this, in some ways, was an attack on everything that we stood for in San Francisco. And a lot of the things that were coming out were just totally false. People may not be aware that there's absolutely no correlation, for example, between deportation rates and public safety, or heightened cooperation between police and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and crime rates. There's no study showing that that does anything. In fact, the opposite is the case, where jurisdictions don't cooperate with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, communities are more safe. And if you look at the violent crime rate in San Francisco from 2014 on, the 2014, the date when we stopped cooperating at all with ICE, the violent crime rate actually went down significantly. So these things were just not being captured by the media, and they were really, really enthralled by this presidential candidate that we all now know what he was about. But at that time, it was very, very intense.
I mean, throughout the film, I think we have snippets, right? And I think for those of us who were sort of following it in real time, we have snippets of different parts of the media, right, reiterating that Mr. Garcia had been convicted had been deported 5 different times, right? He's a felon. There was this narrative that was really being played up. What difference in your mind would it have made if he wasn't an immigrant in this case? What challenges did that present? That fact that he was?
Well, I think I think it's often the case that demagogues will try to find the other, right, in our society to go after in promotion of some kind of the kind of make America great again kind of narrative. So it fell right into that. It's hard to imagine again that this case would have, I think, had it not been this Mexican immigrant that had deportation history, there would have been an openness to discuss whether or not it could be an accident, whether or not this case was really more about the number of guns that are in our society rather than whether or not this was a purposeful shooting. Certainly once it was learned that this involved a ricochet and that it had to travel so far before it hit Kate Steinle in the back, I think that was just such a natural moment for reevaluation. One thing I'll say that during jury selection, because there was so much animosity over the idea of this immigrant and that whole narrative of someone that had been deported so many times, and that was such a big part of the story. I spoke to prospective jurors, and I just wanted to confront that. And I asked them, for instance, if they had ever traveled to another country, and they might tell me, oh yeah, they'd gone to Europe or this or that. And I said, well, let's say you were in Germany or Sweden or wherever you traveled and you were arrested for a crime, everyone to be talking about the fact that you were a foreigner, or would you want whether or not the crime had occurred and whether or not you had done something to commit the crime? And it just helped kind of reorient people a little bit, because they started to understand that, by explicitly saying to them, look, you're not going to get a verdict form that asks you whether or not you like this case. You're not going to get a verdict form about whether or not you agree with certain immigration policies. You're not going to get a verdict form about whether or not someone who's deported should be given attorneys or anything like that. What you're here to decide is this issue about the culpability of a charged crime, and getting jurors to say that they understood that and they would follow that ended up being really important. Francisco?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much more to add on that. I mean, obviously, we crafted several questions to the jury. We were able to get a jury questionnaire to all the prospective jurors. By the way, interesting note here, I was actually called for jury duty on this very case, which is like insane. And so I showed up, I had to tell the judge, and the judge was there waiting for me before I got to go in and hobnob with the jurors. we were able to get questions that the district attorney objected to many of the questions. Like, for example, one of the questions was San Francisco is a sanctuary city. Are you aware of that? And do you have any opinions about it? And, we were able to get those questions in. And then Matt was able to use voir dire in a very, effective way to explain to the jury this has nothing to do with immigration, because obviously it doesn't have, where he was born had no relevance to the case.
Towards the end of the film, there's a theme here, right, about just sort of the challenges of representing someone who's an immigrant. I mean, it comes up in different ways, Matt. The way you're talking about jury selection itself, right? It presents a different set of challenges in trying to find the right composition of jurors. Sophia, I'd love to turn to you as someone who is a bit removed from the facts of the case. Towards the end of the film, I think we hear, if I remember correctly, I think it's Dave Eggers, right, who says something like, and I'm paraphrasing, but that Mr. Garcia was fortunate to have such a strong defense team, and that if things had gone the other way, no one would have batted an eye. What does it say, in your opinion, right? I guess my first question is, had this happened anywhere else where there wasn't such a sort of robust defenders, organization that sort of understands the intricacies of immigration and criminal law? Had this happened elsewhere, would the outcome, do you think, would have been the same?
Well, first of all, I'm super excited to be here with filmmakers, with the public defenders who worked on the case, because when I watched the film, I was like just so inspired by the defense work that went into the case, because to answer your question, it wouldn't be likely. It wouldn't be likely that anyone would win this type of case with this type of media attention, with this type of white nationalist rhetoric being kind of just thrown at this one person and therefore the team around them. It likely wouldn't have happened. I can't really imagine it. I mean, Francisco has been talking about being part of a defense unit where we work with people who are, facing deportation, whether they're incarcerated, whether they're not. At the Bronx Defenders in New York City, we have a similar program where we represent people who are detained and facing deportation. And a lot of the work that I do is in collaboration with criminal defense attorneys, and not just criminal defense attorneys, but family defense attorneys, as well as housing attorneys, because the people that we work with are often at the intersection of so many different types of systemic oppression that is trying to not only, devastate their lives and terrorize them indefinitely, and perpetually punishing them indefinitely just for existing, but also as part of, separating families at every single instance that they can. And that's just not a typical type of lawyering. That's not a typical type of public defense for people who are oftentimes, not even oftentimes, systemically treated as disposable, which is why this film, and I'm so grateful that there is a story around this particular case, because it's very easy to dehumanize people who are poor and to dehumanize people who weren't born in this country or who have a felony conviction. And I feel like this film did a really powerful job of really centering his humanity and centering how these systems are failing people across the country.
I'm curious what your take on that is, Francisco, as somebody who also, has practiced immigration law and has worked closely with immigrants.
We actually modeled our program off of the Bronx Defender and what's going on in New York. I think what Sophia said was very powerful. And it's true, Mr. Garcia Zarate had been arrested previously, and you saw in the movie, he spent 17 years for the act of entering the country. And he had a couple, some drug offenses, possession offenses. In all of those cases prior to this case, he may have had one or two criminal court appearances, pled out, and then ended up being incarcerated. And when we first met him, he was very, very suspicious of us, and it's insistent on simply pleading guilty, because that he felt morally, he felt bad about what had happened. And he had never gone to trial before. He had never experienced a situation where the lawyer, engaged. Well, I don't know, but what we do know is that he never went to trial, and so that was a very unique experience. And by that, after the first month or two was rocky with him, but after some time, we also worked with a representative from the Mexican consulate who was really invaluable in helping build a relationship with him. And I think he slowly learned we were really there to provide a defense for him. But it's really an accusation of our system. The cruelty, the sheer utter cruelty, the punishing nature, the family separation, what we do to people that we don't like or don't want, is outrageous. And I think what Matt said, it would have been really awful had this gone the wrong way, had the outcome been different, because he would be remembered as a person who, was a murderer and was an immigrant. And I think the outcome really helped expose a false narrative. And the press had to come around at some point to realize, wow, this was actually an accident.
Sometimes, and I'm looking at you, Chihiro. Sometimes, films have a way of hopefully, right, teaching us a lesson. We learn, and hopefully, like any good story, right, we learn not to repeat our mistakes. If there is another Mr. Garcia, another situation like this, do you think at this point we've learned our lesson as a society?
I wish I could say yes to that, but I think when we look at the headlines and what's happening in the country, I think all of the issues that were unpacked in this film seem to be, and I wish this wasn't the case, but they just seem to be just as relevant and just as burning issues. I mean, I think we haven't seen much movement in terms of the discussions around immigration yet, even though there has been a change of administration, and obviously a few of the more extreme things have changed, but fundamentally, there were systems in place before Trump, and he was maybe the loudest voice in the room, but these issues haven't gone away. And certainly if you add in the layers of the messaging we get in politics and media on top of that, and how that can amplify or silence certain voices and certain perspectives, I think that is probably 10 times worse even than it was back then. And so, I think I probably could speak for a lot of people and say that I actually have more concerns now. I had some fears when we were making the film that, perhaps after Trump leaves office, this film won't be relevant anymore. And I don't know if it's a good thing that it still is, but I think the reason that this film seems to still be speaking to people is because we're still having these national discussions, or occasionally just loud monologues at each other, and maybe not enough discussion. And my hope with this film is that it could be, at least a way to unpack some of this for people who maybe haven't investigated in a thorough way, as folks like probably everyone in this discussion have, but a way into it to see like, oh, wow, I had this one perspective. And I was interested when I told people I was doing this film, almost everyone knew about this case. Like this case just had that sort of national awareness for people. But most people I talked to didn't even know what the verdict was in the case. I couldn't remember. And a lot of people would refer to it as the Kate Steinle case. The victim's name, nobody knew the name of the defendant. It was just the undocumented immigrant. And so even just when we look at like how this story lodged in people's minds and memories, it's fascinating just to see, there's only 2 or 3 bits of information that stuck. And so I'm hoping with this film, we can actually fill in some of the rest of that picture. In some cases, probably surprise people with what the truth was. And I hope we can apply it to future cases and discussions moving forward.
Just to sort of quickly uplift Cheryl's text chat in the chat. If there are questions, we really want to hear them. But before we go any further, Francisco, it looks like you wanted to add something. Oh, can we? I think the audio. Yep. No, Francisco. Yeah, there you go. Much better.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries.
I just wanted to be a little bit more optimistic about, the result. I think what had happened with the verdict, and there was a similar incident that happened. It was a case of Molly Tibbetts, and it was a woman who was killed, and the defendant was someone who's undocumented. And you had a very different press cycle. I think people started seeing that these, uses and sensational uses of crimes to foment hate against immigrants, we started seeing a different treatment of that in the media. The problem is, like, now you see kind of a building of this anti-immigrant rhetoric again, and unfortunately you also see an administration that doesn't seem to follow through with the promises of immigrant liberation that really helped get Trump out of office. So but I do think there was a slight different take on the media. Matt, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
I think it's so hard to say. I mean, I think the challenge for us, I'm hesitant to blame the media in a real generalized way, because we had some very good reporters on the case. I think the trouble that I saw was that a lot of these reporters wouldn't stay on the case very long. And so once they figured out factually what was happening or what they may have gotten wrong initially, they weren't covering the story anymore. And a new person would come in, and rather than get all the facts right, they would do their research, read the old stories that are repeating the errors, and then start writing the errors again. And some of these errors were things like suggesting that Garcia Zarate had stolen the gun, that, we felt fairly strongly that that just was not only not the case, but certainly couldn't be demonstrated at all, and was fairly important to a question of, whether or not he found this weapon on the pier as he claimed that he had. So, some of these things just through repetition were really dangerous for us. But I can't say that individual journalists were trying to undermine us. I think they just there wasn't a built-in system for correcting the old stories that were wrong.
Thanks, Matt. And Sophia, I actually want to get your take on this. Again, as somebody who's a little bit more removed, right, from the work. The narrative, I want to say, like, in the last few years was, we went through a terrible time with Trump as far as the immigrant community, new president in the White House. What's been your experience as a practitioner when it comes to immigration law and policy?
So complicated question, but I will do my best to succinctly answer. So first, I would say that this issue predates the Trump administration. I mean, it's embedded in our laws. It's been embedded for decades in our laws to target people who have had contact with the criminal legal system. I would say that it actually kind of got even worse under the Obama administration, when he was using phrases like felons, not families, to dictate who should be prioritized for arrest and who should not, meaning that apparently people who have felony convictions don't have families, which is incredibly dehumanizing and kind of, in my opinion, paved the way in many ways for the Trump administration's violent white nationalist rhetoric that we saw for the past, I guess for 4 years. And in terms of the Biden administration and things that have changed since, more people are actually incarcerated by ICE right now under the Trump administration than the final year of, or excuse me, under the Biden administration than under the Trump administration in the final year. He really had an opportunity, and that administration had an opportunity to meaningfully decarcerate ICE detention facilities in the height of a pandemic that is devastating people who are behind bars for all of the obvious reasons that we've known for 2 years now. And that administration's decided not to do that. In terms of how they're prioritizing people for arrest, I would argue that it's more or less the same as well in terms of targeting people who've had criminal arrests. And it's just really, I don't want to say disappointing because I wasn't expecting much from this administration. But I will say that in many ways, the only real difference has been the kind of veneer, whereas the Trump administration was really explicitly violent in everything that they did. And we're actually very proud of the violence that they were inflicting on immigrant communities. Now, the Biden administration will say things like, we're going to use the word non-citizen in all of our different types of memos, or we're going to use the term non-citizen and direct our prosecutors and our officers to use this different type of terminology. So, they can use this different type of terminology to suggest that they care about the people that they continue to, exile from the US-Mexico border, which is a policy that they've continued from the Trump administration, or whether or not in dictating how they decide who to arrest, detain, and deport. So that's my take. I'm sure that there's people who might have a slightly different one, but as someone who's a public defender who does represent people who are incarcerated, as well as do policy work on the city, state, and federal level, it's actually very disheartening how much nothing has really changed.
Got it. Well, I see we actually do have a couple of questions in the chat. This first one comes from Sherlyn Cesar, and the question is, and I think this is for you, Matt and Francisco, curious what your personal opinion of the media was before this case. Did you usually find the news to be a trustworthy source, and how did your opinion change as you proceeded through the case and interacting with the media personally? Maybe we can, feel free, whoever wants to go first.
Francisco, I'll let you go first.
I think, talking about the media, and I've used that term, the media, there was a big difference here between the national and the local reporters. And I think that one of the things we did was in the beginning, right before, at the eve of trial, we actually had individual meetings with reporters that we knew were going to cover the case, that we thought were objective and that could kind of grapple with the complex themes. And we also made ourselves available to the press virtually after every hearing. And the district attorney didn't do that. They had a media consultant, or someone, a public information officer. And so I think that we built strong relationships with reporters. In fact, I periodically text, folks, every now and then when I see them write a good story or notice something important going on that they're covering. And so I did build some good relationships, and I think Matt did as well. But I think the reality is that the national media was just enamored with this concept of an immigration theme. Nobody latched on, other than the local reporters, to the theme of gun violence and gun safety, which is what this case was really about. This is a fully loaded gun with no trigger safety. That was just essentially left in a backpack by a federal agent against all policies, against state law. And you could easily predict something like this would happen. Nobody really latched onto that nationally. And so I think that the national media, there are tremendous problems with the national media and how they kind of cycle these sensational stories. And so obviously I read a lot. I look at the media reports, and I think it's a nuanced kind of sentiment here. But Matt, I turn it over to you.
I'll just add that we were really trying to figure out what to do with the media stories that we found so offensive. One of the stories that got us going was there was a story in the San Francisco Chronicle about how easy this gun is. How difficult it is to fire this gun accidentally. And of course, the journalist, who's a perfectly good journalist, just had spoken to a bunch of gun shop owners, and they were all just talking about how outrageous it was that there could be a claim that these things go off accidentally. And it prompted us to start creating our own media. And so the rules of professional conduct do not allow you to try your case in the press. However, you are allowed to defend your client in the press if you didn't initiate the information. At least the rule is something to that effect in California. And so we started to put out stories just directly. Like I published a story about, this particular Sig Sauer's pistols history of accidental discharges. And we just laid out a case against the gun. Published stories about how Kate's Law would not have had any impact on this case. We talked about the Bureau of Land Management officer and the rules he had broken by transporting a gun in the manner that he had. We wrote about Sanctuary City. We talked directly about our client's own criminal record because it was being repeated so many times. He was this multiple felon and all these deportations. And we just said, fine, let's break it down. This is someone that hadn't really committed any kind of offense in about 25 years. All of his, prison sentences were for coming back into the country to try to get work, and just kind of trying to break this down in a way that when new reporters came onto the case, we would say, well, go read those stories and you'll be brought up to speed. The other thing that we did that corresponded with this kind of media push on our part was that Garcia Zarate up to that time had been known through an alias, AKA another name that he had used previously, Juan Francisco Lopez Sanchez. And by obtaining his birth certificate with the assistance of the Mexican consul, we were able to go into court and say, look, we want him to be called by his true name. And but there was also, we realized for ourselves, it was going to correspond with our publishing of our own media under the name that he would be going to trial under. So it was almost like a reset button that was super effective, I think. After the trial, I also published articles about how Garcia Zarate did not get a fair trial in issues like that, because I didn't want much of the things that had happened to us in the courtroom not to be recorded somewhere. I wanted people to know that we won in spite of some very bad rulings that almost undermined our effort.
I have two follow-up questions, both of them coming from the audience. Very quickly, you mentioned the federal agent. Do either of you know if the agent suffered any consequences? And the second question is, we're talking about the media. Do you have a sense of how the foreign media covered this case, if at all?
I'll address the latter question. I'm not aware of how the foreign media covered it. Maybe Francisco is, but I love the question. Francisco?
I'm not aware. What I do know, my dad was in Spain at the time and called me and said, I saw you on TV during the arraignment. So, but other than that, I think, my family was actually kind of worried about me handling this case. And because at that time, when it first started, he was portrayed as some, evil person that had done wrong. And, but no, I'm unfamiliar with how the foreign press.
And do either of you know what consequences, if any, the federal agent suffered? The one who left or, had their gun stolen?
Francisco, you want to take that?
He was promoted, and there was an article on NPR about how he had been promoted a year, but I don't think he suffered any discipline. We were able to see there was a complaint filed, and he had to kind of explain what happened, but we are aware he was promoted the year after, and I don't know where he is right now.
I mean, I guess, as we get closer to time, I'm curious, the film ends with an update, right, on sort of where Mr. Garcia was at the time that the film concludes. Where is he right now in this moment in time? Matt, Francisco, either of you can take that question.
Francisco, is he in Los Angeles or is he in Northern California now?
I believe that the last time I checked, he was in Santa Rita County Jail in Alameda County. And I think he's been moved between Los Angeles and Santa Rita.
So the big issue with Garcia Zarate is that the feds wanted to charge him with illegally entering the country and prosecute him that way again. That's what they said right after the verdict. But it turned out that they couldn't charge him with that because he hadn't illegally re-entered the country. He had finished a jail sentence when he was released. And so they pivoted to charge him with illegal possession of a firearm. And although ultimately he was exonerated of that in the state courts, the feds can prosecute him with that without a double jeopardy claim because they add an element to the offense that dealing with the crossing of state lines. And since the gun was manufactured in a different state, there's no allegation that he brought the gun, but it's enough to satisfy this idea that he's being charged with a different crime. Garcia Zarate has had a lot of mental health challenges over his life, and the judge on the eve of the trial found that he was not competent to stand trial. And so the trial proceedings were suspended, and he was essentially, rendered just to remain in the custody of the federal government until his competency could be restored through medication or whatever other means. And so that apparently happened. They brought him back to court, I think, to try to see if they could go to trial with him again. I think it was another determination that he had deteriorated between the finding that he was okay and in that court appearance. And so that whole thing cycled again. He was facing life in prison. In our case, under the federal gun possession charge, he's facing about 10 years in prison. And so he's starting to get to a point where he has served that sentence. And my understanding is that the negotiations with the federal prosecutors are that they are prepared to let him be deported if he enters a plea of guilty and get him out of the country. However, he has to be competent in order to get through a plea. And so it's just in limbo. Francisco, is that accurate?
Yes. And just for the audience to understand, he's being charged with the act of picking up something he didn't know was a gun and then it discharging accidentally and then him throwing the gun into the water. So we're talking about a 2 to 3 second act where he would be facing 10 years in prison. The reason that we were able to reverse the conviction in state court for gun possession was that the judge refused to instruct the jury that they could find him not guilty if they believed that he didn't know the object that he had picked up was a gun. And it was a relatively easy case. It was really well litigated on appeal, but it was an easy case for the appellate court to simply reverse because it was a pretty egregious mistake by the judge to not have a mistake of fact instruction.
I think we're close to time. One last question, right? I think today's discussion has generated, a lot of thoughts, hopefully for the audience. If I'm watching this, right, for folks who are just sort of listening in, if you're watching this and you're not steeped into immigration policy, you're not a public defender, but you are, you have thoughts and you have, you have a new perhaps understanding of situations like these. What can people do to get involved? What's the call to action here? Wonder if any of you have thoughts on that. Sophia, can I go to Sophia just very quickly?
Yeah. Well,
I'm also still thinking about everything you all just said and the fact that he's still incarcerated, that he's being federally prosecuted for something that is just entirely unnecessary. One moment that really stood out in the film that I just have to uplift is at one point, I think it was you, Francisco, who asked him, what is the difference between the United States and Mexico? And the thing that he said was prison, and the fact that he has spent the overwhelming majority of his life in prison for simply moving his body and migrating across a line that we really do not need to be using our resources to federally prosecute someone who has schizophrenia and is struggling with mental health and was, charged with these different types of crimes and then found innocent and acquitted, and yet still here he is. So I think one thing that I would really want to uplift is to learn about these types of cases and to really get involved when you hear about these types of cases, and pressuring particularly prosecutors, whether it's at the state level or at the federal level, to dismiss charges. I mean, it's egregious to me that they're continuing to use and prosecute this case, again, despite it being a new administration, despite everything that happened at the state level. It just really doesn't make sense. And I know so many amazing organizers and activists that do a lot on what I would call a participatory defense campaign to free people from prison who don't need to be in. There's so much organizing work, particularly by abolitionists right now, to support people who are incarcerated. So whether that's doing petitions, whether that's finding people in your community who are doing that work, or whether it's just even studying, because I would say that study and struggle is something that is really critical. So finding authors and writers and thinkers and activists who have really dedicated their lives to this, I think is really critical, because we really cannot keep sustaining this apparatus of mass detention and deportation. It serves no one, really, in my opinion, at all.
Matt, I think I cut you off. I'll let you have the last word, and then I'll turn it over to Cheryl.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think in a real generalized way, I think, not, how to say, not reaching a conclusion too quickly about things that you're told are true or false. I mean, I think, we all do it in our lives. I mean, I'll read a police report and I'll be like, oh my God, I can't believe he did this. And then he did that. Okay. And I've been doing this a long time. And then I go talk to a client and they're like, no, that's not how it happened. It had this happen and then that happened. They did that to me. And you realize, oh my God, it's a completely different story. And that's the thing, we all have to work really hard to check ourselves and not just go for that narrative, the first one that we hear. It might be true, but it might really not be true. And it's something we can all do in our lives.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you, all of you, for your work on this case and sharing your perspective. Cheryl, kick it back to you.
Thanks, Harold. I want to again thank all of you who participated in this Q&A this afternoon. Matt, Francisco, Sophia, Chihiro, and Harold, both for joining us and for the really important work you do. It's really interesting hearing about it, and I only wish we had more time together. I also want to thank everyone who joined us this afternoon. A reminder that all of the films for the festival will be streaming on demand all weekend. And we also have a number of great programs coming up. So please join us and invite your friends and family to join us. Our next program is a Q&A on our short programming, taking place tomorrow at 2 p.m. I hope to see you all then. Have a great weekend, everyone. And thank you. Bye.